So what was your first game that you ever played?
My first game I ever played was Pong.
Ah.
Yeah.
Oops. I'm playing this one. What do I do? I don't understand.
I don't think you want it to get into your side.
Yeah.
You don't want it to go into your goal. You're like goalies.
Who am I?
What is your favorite game?
My favorite game would be Secret of Mana on
Has video games positively influenced you?
Super Nintendo. Video games have positively influenced me. Obviously, I'm able to work my own business with it, which has allowed me to connect with a lot of people I wouldn't have connected with, different age groups of people.
And do you think it's positive influence towards children?
I do think it's a positive influence towards children.
And is it a positive influence toward just society in general?
I believe it is, yes.
Alright.
I believe it allows people to relax and hang out and play in a safe environment. And, yeah,
And would you say it brings people together?
I do. I think it does. I think it brings a lot of people together. You can play online now a lot with people all over the world and so on like that. So.
Huh. And do you think it's definitely improved?
Yes, I do. I mean, not only graphics, but gameplay. It's just a huge. The designing behind it now. There's so much to that. Millions of jobs involved. So, yeah.
I'm playing this one. What do I do? I don't understand.
The Atari 2600 was not the first home video game console, but it was one of the most popular and revolutionized video games as we know them today. At the time, you could only play video games by going to an arcade, but with an Atari 2600, you could play it right in your own home. Shown here is the extremely large library of games for the Atari 2600, which included many original titles, including Combat, which is pictured here with the joystick, and arcade titles such as Donkey Kong and Pac-Man. However, this particular port was of extremely poor quality, sold terribly, and to this day is considered to be one of the worst ports of an arcade title to a home console. In the years to come, many knockoffs of the Atari 2600, such as the Intellivision and Doublevision, both developed by Mattel, were released, but none were able to recapture the success that Atari had held. Atari itself released a successor to the 2600 known as the 5200, but due to its bulky size and awkward control, it was nowhere near successful. And for a while, it seemed as though the video game industry was on a roll. But then, in 1983, due to an oversaturation in the market of extremely poor quality titles, such as the E.T. video game, which is so terrible we're not allowed to show it here, caused the video game market to completely crash. Nintendo Entertainment System, the video game crash of 1983, for short, was actually an American video games may have been done of a Japanese home console company in Japan as the Famicom Nintendo Family Computer. The NES was actually inferior to the Famicom in some ways, as the Famicom was top-loading rather than side-loading like the NES, and also it had a microphone built into one of the controllers, whereas the NES had none. It was one of the first home 8-bit systems, meaning it had graphics and sound and gameplay and games themselves so complex they were some of the most advanced of their time. Many gaming greats, such as Super Mario Bros., Castlevania, and Metroid, all first found their installments here on the NES. The NES was extremely successful, continued for 6 years, and then spawned its successor. On November 20th, 1990, Nintendo of America released the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES for short. It came with the tagline, "Now you're playing with power, superpower." And they couldn't be more correct. The SNES ran on 16 bits, double the NES's 8 bits, meaning it had double the processing power, double the graphics capabilities, double the sound capabilities, and, at least according to the ad campaign, double the games. In fact, the SNES actually had more games than the NES, and many were considered to be even better than their predecessors. Games like Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, pictured here, is considered to be one of the best of its series, which is a pretty good series to begin with. Other games, such as Super Castlevania 4, Super Star Wars, yeah, most of these had Super in the title, also came out, and they also were very good and very successful. It was also one of the first 3D consoles, and it had a special Super FX chip that could render three-dimensional polygons on screen. However, only one game uses, and that would be Star Fox, which is considered to be one of the best games on the console. But the SNES had come as something of a marketing ploy, a desperate last-bit gamble, if you will. Several years earlier, Sega, Nintendo's main rival, had released the Genesis, or the Mega Drive as it was known in Japan. It was very similar to the NES, with one small difference. It was a 16-bit console, making it one of the largest and most powerful consoles of the time, and hence, it was, I guess in a sense, better than Nintendo. In fact, the ad campaign at the time said, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." Yeah, I know, it was the 90s, you gotta cut them some slack. But with that being said, they were right at Sega Genesis, the Sega people, they were right about it. They had a huge advantage over Nintendo. So when the SNES came around, Sega was thinking, whoa, okay, they took a step back, because now they were on an equal playing field. In fact, the SNES was technically superior to the Genesis in almost every single way, except for one. It had a slightly slower processor, meaning that Sega Genesis had faster scrolling action, hence games like Sonic the Hedgehog. Sega exploited this in their ad campaign, saying Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Technically behind Nintendo and capabilities of their games and graphics and sound, etc., etc., they started releasing attachments to their games. It was around this time that CDs were becoming popular, and it seemed like discs were the way to go. So, Sega added an attachment to the Sega Genesis known as the Sega CD, which used discs for the games. And at the time, this was a revolutionary idea. However, the games were of very poor quality, seemed rushed out just to cash in on the concept, and there were only a few quality Sega CD games. A second Sega console add-on, which is not pictured here, called the Sega 32X, which at the time was double the processing power of what Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo could do. However, like the Sega CD, very few good games were made for the 32X, and it failed. In the end, it seems as though Sega had lost the console war. For now. It was in the mid-90s that Nintendo released their new Nintendo 64. A 64-bit system, which allowed for, with the higher processing power, fully 3D graphics and excellent, very, very, very high-quality sound and games. Many great games, such as GoldenEye 007, Star Wars Rogue Squadron, among others, including Legend of Zelda, and with games like GoldenEye, well, multiplayer was back, it was better than ever, and it challenged friendships.
Not to play odd job. Okay? 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 Because he's too short. I can't aim straight. Okay?
Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask were released on this console, and it seemed as though Nintendo was back on top again. But there were disadvantages. You see, the Nintendo 64 wasn't the first 64-bit console. Earlier, Atari, trying to recapture some of its former glory, had created a console known as the Atari Jaguar, which ran on two twin 32-bit processors to create a technical 64-bit console. But like many other attempts before it, it was highly unsuccessful and has disappeared into obscurity ever since. Nintendo 64, on the other hand, was highly successful, and many thought that Nintendo was back on top. But the thing was, it still ran on cartridges, which were beginning to consider bulky, as CDs were coming into the market and becoming more and more popular. Now, at the time, Nintendo had no real competitors, but then appeared Sony? Yes, Sony had decided to make a game console. Earlier in the decade, they had tried to team up with Nintendo to create a disc-based console. However, plans had fallen through and the console was never made. Earlier, Nintendo had also tried to do this with Philips software, but they too had failed to comply, and as a result, thus was created the extremely forgettable Philips CDI. But back on the subject. Sony took the plans for their disc-based console and created their own console, which they called the PlayStation, which had almost the same gameplay, sound, and graphics capabilities as the Nintendo 64, but it ran on discs, and it was less bulky, including with a more tighter-fitting controller and, well, no cartridges. So the CDs were very easy to carry around, and it was quite popular with the crowd. Nintendo's popularity faded by the minute, and in the end, the Nintendo 64 ended not with a bang, but with a whimper.